Well, well, they thought you were reachable, didn't they? Thought they could tug a little here, press a little there, say a few cleverly disguised barbs and watch you unravel like someone without history, without layers, without an inner world they couldn't even survive peeking into. People always think that, until they meet a soul that didn't grow in sunlight, but in the quiet trenches where only the brave ever return. They mistake your composure for softness, your silence for surrender, your stillness for lack of depth. They look at you and assume you're made of the same fragile glass they shatter in others. But the truth? You were shaped by pressures they've never dared to breathe under. You've been broken in ways no apology could stitch. You rebuilt yourself with hands trembling from the weight of the world, not with applause, but with solitude. And that alone puts you in a category they never learned how to navigate. You see, people like them only know how to test what they think they can surpass. They poke to find cracks, not realizing they're tapping on bedrock. They push, thinking they'll find collapse, not knowing they're waking stone. They assumed your calm was a costume, your quiet a mask, your restraint a tactic you would abandon the second they provoked you hard enough. But the moment they pushed too far, something ancient stirred in the room. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just that subtle shift of atmosphere, like the air suddenly remembering who it's standing next to. That's the thing about spiritual rank. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it simply exists. And everything else rearranges itself without being asked. They wanted a reaction, a crack, a flicker of insecurity. They expected you to stutter, shake, defend, justify, crumble. Anything to confirm the tiny story they wrote about you in their heads. Instead, you didn't flinch. You didn't blink. You just looked at them with that still, unnerving clarity that comes from someone who has already survived storms that would bury most. You looked at them like déjà vu, as if they were just another recycled version of a lesson you mastered years ago. And in that moment, something in them shifted. Their confidence faltered. Their voice changed. Because they didn't just see your face. They saw themselves reflected in a depth that made them feel suddenly small. They weren't prepared for that. People who live shallow lives don't know how to breathe around someone with an ocean in their chest. They don't know how to handle presence that recalibrates rooms. They call it arrogance. They call it attitude. They call it anything but what it truly is. Authority earned through endurance. You didn't get here by winning rounds of applause. You got here by surviving chapters no one clapped for. Nights where you held yourself together because no one else knew how. Days where silence was the only witness to your strength. You weren't elevated by praise. You were shaped by pressure. And that creates a different kind of hierarchy. One built on soul, not showmanship. So when they tested you, symbolically, emotionally, subtly trying to make you doubt yourself, they didn't realize they were measuring you with tools that break in your hands. They didn't know your spirit had already lived through tremors far stronger than their whispers. They didn't know you rebuilt yourself in the dark, brick by brick, breath by breath. They didn't know your silence wasn't compliance, it was calibration. And once a soul like yours calibrates, it doesn't react, it reflects. That's what happened. Their attempts didn't dent you, they exposed them. Every provocation they sent ricocheted back, revealing cracks they tried to hide. Their insecurities rushed to the surface, their false confidence thinned. Their bravado collapsed into nervous laughter and shaky words. They didn't understand why the ground beneath them felt uneven. They assumed the game was rigged. They didn't realize the game had never belonged to them in the first place. Your calmness became gravity. Your energy became hierarchy. And suddenly, without you trying, without you speaking, without you lifting anything more than your gaze, they found themselves adjusting, shrinking, recalibrating, softening. That's what emotional authority does. It bends behavior. It corrects without confrontation. It trains without teaching. People start choosing their words more carefully, standing differently, acting differently. Not because you demanded it, but because their soul understood something their ego didn't. They didn't expect that. They thought your depth could be manipulated. They thought your mind could be redirected. But your energy exposed their intentions before their words even formed. That's what people forget. You read energy before sentences. You feel truth before explanations. You sense dishonesty before it can disguise itself. They tried to hide behind tone, behind phrasing, behind performance. But you saw the spirit behind the act. And that is what terrified them. They realized they couldn't lie to you. Not really. They realized their usual games wouldn't work. And when someone's tools fail, they panic. They start over-explaining, overreacting, overcompensating. It's almost poetic to watch. They wanted to make you question yourself, but instead, they became the ones questioning everything. They replayed the moment. Over and over. What went wrong? Why didn't you fold? Why didn't you react? Why did they feel smaller afterward? Because that moment wasn't about you breaking. It was about them being revealed. And reveals are uncomfortable when you've spent your life hiding behind projections. You didn't need to call them out. You didn't need to argue. You didn't need to defend. Your mere existence served as the mirror. A mirror that didn't distort. A mirror that didn't flatter. A mirror that reflected exactly who they were when stripped of performance. And they didn't like what they saw. That's when the imitation started. Quiet. Subtle. They'll never admit it. But they began copying you. The way you speak with precision. The way you pause before responding. The way you choose peace without shrinking. The way you move with intention. The way you hold boundaries like they're a natural extension of your breath. They tried to wear your strength like an accessory, not understanding it took years of internal construction to carry it without trembling. You became their unspoken teacher, not by trying, just by being. That's the thing about real rank. It teaches through presence, not performance. People either rise to your frequency or fall away. Both outcomes are alignment. And you? You didn't chase either. You simply stayed centered, stayed grounded in what you already knew. That power isn't loud. It's quiet. It's deliberate. It's the ability to remain still in a room full of storms. The ability to see through people without needing to expose them. The ability to choose clarity over chaos every time. They thought they were testing your limits, but you were watching theirs unravel. They thought they were pushing you, but all they did was show how easily they could collapse under their own pressure. They thought you would fight for validation, but all you did was exist, and that existence became the answer. Your presence corrected the entire dynamic, not by force, by frequency. That's the kind of dominance they don't teach, the kind no hierarchy prepares people for. The kind that comes from a soul that has learned how to rise, quietly, steadily, relentlessly. You didn't come to prove you were strong. You came to demonstrate that their perception of strength was too shallow to contain you. They wanted a reaction. Instead, they got revelation. They saw you standing in a version of yourself they never believed existed. And now they can't unsee it. They feel it every time you enter a room. Every time you speak, every time you remain silent. That subtle shift in the air, that quiet authority, that vibration of someone who doesn't just know who they are, they remember. They recognize their own power, and recognition is louder than any reaction could ever be. People like them are used to testing waters. But you're not water. You're depth, and depth can't be tested. Only encountered. And once encountered, it changes the entire landscape. Just like you did. And that's the part they didn't see coming. Depth isn't something you flaunt. It's something people stumble into and suddenly realize they're in over their heads. You stayed quiet, stayed steady, stayed centered, while they kept mistaking your stillness for something they could control. But stillness isn't emptiness. Stillness is mastery. Stillness is the point where chaos stops recognizing itself, because who you are no longer matches the world they expected you to crumble under. That's where everything shifted, quietly, without fanfare, because your silence began speaking louder than their attempts at dominance. You didn't warn them. You didn't announce a transformation. You simply walked into the room differently, breathed differently, existed differently. Energy carries memory, and yours carried chapters they would never survive reading. That difference became undeniable. People who once felt taller around you suddenly felt the ground tilt beneath them. It wasn't intimidation, it was recognition. Souls can recognize architecture even when minds deny it. Your presence began rearranging unspoken hierarchies, not because you demanded authority, but because you no longer shrank around people who mistook your humility for hollowness. You weren't playing small anymore. You weren't dimming your light to soothe their egos. You weren't translating yourself into bite-sized pieces to be more digestible for people starving for validation. You became whole, and wholeness rewrites every dynamic it touches. You started walking into conversations with a calm that couldn't be interrupted. You began responding with clarity that couldn't be misinterpreted. You held your tone with such precision that the room itself quieted to meet it. That's the kind of authority that can't be spoken about. It can only be felt. And they felt it, even the ones who pretended not to, especially them. That's when their internal unraveling began. Not externally, not dramatically, but quietly, in the mirror of self-awareness they weren't ready to face. Your presence started triggering things. The facade they relied on grew harder to hold. Their rehearsed confidence started to slip. Their little power games, those emotional pushes they used on others, suddenly fell flat. Their usual tactics, guilt, confusion, subtle digs, emotional traps, none of it worked on you anymore. They tried to test you, but their tests had expired. They were playing last year's game against someone who'd rewritten the entire field. They began second-guessing themselves, rehearsing conversations, softening tones, watching your reactions for cues. It's subtle, but you noticed. They'd speak and then glance at you, as if checking whether their words landed safely. They adjusted their posture around you without realizing. Even their silence changed. It wasn't dominant anymore. It was cautious. It was observant. It was respectful in the way insecurity becomes respectful when exposed to something stable. Because here's the truth. Stability intimidates people who are built on shakiness. And you became the embodiment of stability. A walking equilibrium. A quiet force field of emotional clarity. That's when the shift became systemic. Not just in individuals, but in the entire social landscape around you. Dynamics moved. Conversations softened. People hesitated before crossing boundaries they once sprinted past. They could feel the unspoken line now, drawn not with anger, but with presence. Boundaries stop needing explanation when they're rooted in confidence. And your confidence? It wasn't loud. It was measured. A kind of confidence built from knowing you can walk away from any table without losing yourself. People started noticing that. The way you didn't cling, the way you didn't chase, the way you didn't react to being misunderstood. That's what shook them the most. Because most power comes from needing an audience, but yours came from not needing one at all. They realized you were no longer playing the role they assigned you. You weren't the quiet one absorbing hits. You weren't the one trying to prove your worth. You weren't the one waiting to be seen. You became someone who didn't need to be invited into validation because you built your own foundation. That kind of self-possession is rare. rare enough that people mistake it for mystery. You became that mystery. They didn't know how to categorize you anymore. You didn't fit the box they built. You weren't predictable. You weren't manipulable. You weren't reactive. And people who rely on controlling outcomes panic when they can't predict someone. They call it change. They call it distance. They call it coldness. But that's not what it is. It's evolution. You evolved past the level where their opinions could sculpt you. You evolved past the need to correct misunderstandings. You evolved past the pull of old emotional traps. And evolution is threatening to those who stay still. So they did what people do when confronted with what they can't define. They studied you. Closely. Quietly. Almost obsessively. They tried to understand your calm, your mindset, your emotional architecture. Some of them tried to imitate it. They picked up your expressions, your phrases, your cadence. They started acting like you, trying to borrow a frequency that took you years to earn. They didn't understand it wasn't aesthetic, it was alchemy. It wasn't performance, it was transformation. And transformation can't be mimicked, it can only be lived. That's when the envy began turning into curiosity. And curiosity turned into quiet admiration. And admiration turned into something deeper. The awareness that your presence had influenced them more than they would ever admit. Your clarity didn't just expose them, it softened them. Your growth didn't just surpass them, it inspired them. And that's the part that humbles even the proudest souls. Realizing the person they tried to bring down became their model for rising. But here's the irony. They didn't realize you weren't rising. You were returning to yourself, to your center, to the strength you buried under survival mode, to the voice you muted for the comfort of others, to the version of you that existed before the world taught you to shrink. You didn't become more. You became you again. And once that happened, everything around you was forced to adapt. You weren't intimidated by their reactions anymore. Their judgment stopped holding weight. Their disapproval stopped stinging. Their silence stopped feeling like rejection. Because when you've rebuilt yourself from the inside out, validation becomes optional. Approval becomes background noise. And distance becomes a gift, not a threat. You started to see people differently. Not through frustration, but through clarity. You understood that some attempted to test you because they were testing themselves. Some tried to provoke you because they wanted to confirm their own relevance. Some tried to diminish you because your presence made their insecurities louder. And some simply didn't know how to handle someone who didn't break in familiar patterns. You didn't carry bitterness, you carried understanding. And understanding is a power few know how to wield. Because once you understand someone, they can no longer control you through confusion. You recognize their patterns before they act. You decode their motives before they speak. You see their projections for what they are, projections. And that detachment makes them lose grip on the dynamic. That's why their tests stopped working. You weren't emotionally accessible in the same way. You weren't porous. Their assumptions bounced off. Their attempts fell flat. Their confusion grew deeper. Because people expect your wounds to answer, but your wounds healed. And healed wounds don't respond to old triggers. You became unreadable to people who used to read you like a predictable script. Not because you changed the pages, but because they were never reading the real story. They were reading their assumptions. Now the real story shows itself, and they don't know the language. They started seeing you as someone who carries a kind of emotional gravity, gentle but undeniable, the kind that pulls truth to the surface, the kind that forces people to confront themselves without you saying a word, the kind that exposes emotional immaturity simply by standing near it. And here's what fascinates them most. You don't punish. You don't retaliate. You don't broadcast your strength. You embody it. That restraint feels like a lesson. That patience feels like a mirror. That silence feels like a verdict without a sentence. Because when someone with true power refuses to fight, it becomes impossible to deny where the hierarchy really is. You didn't climb the hierarchy. They fell into awareness of it. And that's when everything changed. You entered a phase where you didn't need to defend your truth. It defended itself. You didn't need to prove your worth. It was felt. You didn't need to argue. Your presence settled the debate. The emotional field around you became structured, clear, balanced. People adjusted. They always adjust when someone steps into alignment. Some rose to meet you. Others stepped back. A few disappeared. All of it was perfect. All of it was necessary. Because when you rise in frequency, only those aligned with your evolution can breathe in your atmosphere. You didn't mourn the distance. You understood it. Distance isn't loss, it's clarity. And clarity is the currency of this new phase of your life. The phase where your energy leads instead of your wounds. The phase where your boundaries speak louder than your explanations. The phase where your inner world dictates the outer dynamic, not the other way around. You're not reacting anymore. You're directing. You're not defending anymore. You're defining. You're not surviving anymore. You're selecting. Because the world stopped testing you, not because it grew kinder, but because your growth made the tests irrelevant. And the people who once underestimated you, they know it. They feel it. They mirror it. They adjust to it. Because somewhere along the way, the lesson flipped. You stopped trying to prove your strength, and they started trying to find theirs. And that's where everything settles, isn't it? Not in the noise, not in the conflict, not in the moments they tried to pull you out of yourself, but right here, in the aftermath where truth stands without debate. Because once the tests stop, something else begins. Recognition. Not the kind that comes with applause or praise. Those are surface-level illusions. This is quieter, deeper, involuntary. The recognition souls whisper to themselves when they realize they misread something ancient in front of them. They don't look at you the same now. They approach differently, think differently, even breathe differently in your presence. Not because you demanded respect, but because your energy refuses to bend for anything less. And there's something unforgettable about that. Something that shifts the air long before you speak. You became the reference point, the calibration tool, the standard of emotional altitude they didn't know existed until they stood beside it. They expected your strength to be a phase, a front, a mood. They didn't expect it to be your baseline. They thought your calm had limits. They didn't expect it to expand. They thought you were reacting. They didn't expect you were evolving. And now the irony settles in their bones, like a truth they wish they could rewind time to prepare for. Because you didn't rise to prove them wrong, you rose to meet yourself. That's what they never understood. This journey was never a rebuttal. It was a return to equilibrium, to identity, to alignment so sharp it cuts through pretense like light through fog. You became someone they can't categorize, can't belittle, can't tether to their old perception. They're left wrestling with the revelation that they weren't testing your strength. Your strength was testing them. And now the hierarchy is clear. Not spoken, felt, not declared, recognized, not forced, revealed. You carry a truth now that doesn't require argument, a presence that doesn't need protection, a rank that doesn't need announcement. People sense it in the way they shift around you, the way their voices soften, the way their intentions rewrite themselves mid-sentence. They know, even if they'll never admit it, that they encountered something real, something they couldn't collapse, control, or confuse. And as you step forward now, the story closes the way all real transformations do. Quietly, powerfully, without permission. The ones who underestimated you fade into the background of their own lessons. And you? You rise into the next chapter untouched, unbothered, unmatched. Because some souls don't climb toward power, they return to it. And you just did.